So good afternoon. My name is Taifa Alexander, and I am the Assistant Dean of Students for Diversity and Leadership Development at Wofford College. Thank you all for joining today's session. We're our panelists, Dr. David Martinez, Assistant Professor of Educational Leadership and Policies in the College of Education at University of South Carolina, and Pierre Lucian, Academic Advisor at Harvard University and Policy Analyst for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, will engage us in a discussion that will provide us with an opportunity to receive an overview of how systemic oppression and the unequal distribution of power operate to create institutions of higher education where it frustrates students of color and difference ability not only to thrive, but to simply exist. And as a reminder, a prerequisite for attending this session and for engaging in anti-racism work is an understanding of one's own position in a racist society and using your privilege to challenge racism wherever you experience it, whether it's in society, in your home, in the classroom, at work, and even within yourself. So this acknowledgement of self-awareness and commitment is integral in being able to use your dominant identity to center and uplift marginalized voices as equitable partners in disrupting oppressive systems of inequity wherever present. And so I thank you all for committing to that fight. In an effort to frame our discussion today, first I'll introduce Dr. David Martinez. Then, based on questions that were submitted during the registration process, I'll present a series of carefully curated questions to be answered. Once we've exhausted those questions, then we'll transition to our second panelist, Mr. Pierre Lucian, who will also engage in some discussion based on submitted questions. Once we've exhausted those questions, we'll go into the Q&A portion of the panel. And so as attendees, you all had the opportunity to submit questions in your registration form for our panelists. However, you can also send questions to Dr. Rhiannon Liebrich, a member of the Anti-Racism Action Team, privately through the chat feature for the Q&A portion at the end of the discussion. So we will make every effort to answer as many questions as possible. However, we may not be able to answer all questions. And after the hour, there will be an option for session attendees to engage in breakout rooms at the end of the hour. There will be an anti-racism action team organizer in each room to help guide your discussions. So please note that while the panelist discussion and Q&A portion of the session will be recorded, the breakout rooms will not be recorded. And finally, any attendee who is engaging in disrespectful, harassing, or racist behavior will be removed from this session and all other sessions going forward. So now we'll transition and introduce Dr. Martinez. So David G. Martinez is an assistant professor of educational leadership and policies in the College of Education at the University of South Carolina. He's worked extensively in traditionally marginalized Latinx and Indigenous communities as an advocate, educator, and researcher. Prior to pursuing his professorship, David was an educational administrator in Northern Illinois and a middle school and high school educator. David earned his doctorate at Arizona State University. He currently serves as a Center for Innovation in Higher Education Fellow, AERA, Fiscal Issues, Policy and Education Finance, SIG Treasurer, and a National Education Finance Academy Board of Trustees member. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Martinez.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you everyone for being here on this wonderful afternoon. If I look over to my side, I have a 2.5-year-old who runs around and has full agency within this house. So it's me trying to comfort her, or it's me attempting to keep her from dominating my conversation here. So just a heads up warning for everyone with parents. And she actually just came down. We were talking about popsicles earlier. just a shout out. She just came down. That's why I turned to the side and asked me for a popsicle. So.
Thank you, Dr. Martinez. And so we're gonna just jump right in. As educators, we oftentimes tell students that we're preparing them here and now in the academy to be able to fix the problems out in the real world, right? The irony and assumption in those oftentimes lofty articulations of supposed preparation is that it assumes that the same problems of racism, bias, inequity, colonization that exist out there are not also operating in here, as if we're not already within higher education in the belly of the beast, so to speak. So how did we get here as a society? And more specifically, how have we arrived at a time and space where institutions of higher education operate to perpetuate and uphold systems of oppression that result in inequitable treatment for our students of color and difference?
Yeah, what a wonderfully robust question to start the conversation off with, right? So there's multiple points of articulation that I'll get to. What I want to first do before I get to answering the question of how we got here is I want to just give a couple of thank yous to some folks. First, I want to recognize the indigenous peoples of South Carolina, including the Gullah, because no one could regulate indigeneity, place, space, or community, right? So we have to continue to acknowledge those peoples recognized and unrecognized by policy, and that this land, inclusive of this place that I sit in, is not my own. I want to thank Taifa Alexander, Rhiannon Liebrick, James Neighbors, Nadia Glover, Camille Bethea, Dr. T. Tasha Smith-Tyus, James Stooks, Tiara Woney, Jessica Scott Felder, Kimberly Hall, Kimberly Rosen, and everyone at the Anti-Racism Action Team for having me here today. And I'll tell you why that this is so important for me as an individual. I keep getting invited to these formal and informal talks, and honestly, I am astounded that I even have a seat at the table. So if you follow me on Twitter at all, or if you don't follow me on Twitter, it's at From Fire to Table, and that has a deep meaning for me. What at From Fire to Table means is that I've come to a transitionary period where I feel like I hold a seat now, right? And it's my responsibility to make sure that I'm using my voice and that I'm using my privilege in order to participate in some policy praxis to support others on their pipeline to the table as well, right? Movements that respect voice and change are always going to recognize that systemic oppression has been in higher education and in every facet of every policy practice in this nation. The question asks, how did we get here? But frankly, it's not how did we get here. We haven't known anything different. Higher education was not built for Black, Indigenous, Latinx communities. We haven't arrived really at a place and space that operates to perpetuate white supremacy and oppression. Really what we're doing is operating within a system that is inherently in and of itself racially motivated and oppressive. The systems of inequity, and I would argue that operate now today in contemporary higher education, are similar to those systems that operated when Harvard, St. John's, William and Mary were established, right? Now, I'm here discussing anti-racism work and discussing critical consciousness at Wofford. These three institutions that I just named, however, were founded in the 1600s. Let's think about this. How many presidents have they had that were people of color? How many times have presidents even been up for those positions? These are the oldest institutions in the nation with some of the greatest thinkers, right? How many women of color have even been tapped for positions of power inside of higher education, inside of university, inside of policy practice and policy praxis institutions, right? Let's think about this. John Russwurm, Edward Jones, Alexander Lucius Twilight graduated from their respective institutions of higher education in the 1820s. These were all Black men. 240 years later, Wofford admitted their first Black student, Albert W. Gray. Think about the time it took for us to get here. The question isn't about place and space. The question really isn't necessarily even about how do we operate to dismantle systems of oppression that result in inequitable treatment of system. The question is, what are we doing to recognize that we're working inside of that system and that it is our responsibility to do what we can as individuals of that system, as individuals of that structure now, in order to dismantle those systems of oppression that continue to hold back students of color. We were in concert a couple days ago, a group of us, and y'all brought up Black Waffle. Now I was a little taken aback. I thought to myself, these informal voices, are we paying attention to this? Are we giving them their due note? Are we ourselves being willing participants within the anti-Blackness that these students are trying to convey to us? How are we, if we think we are not, trying to reinforce a critical consciousness throughout our institution? Higher education thinks of people like me, Mexican, first generation, immigrant, as an aberration to its entire structure. That's the system that I came into. Now, I consider myself an advocate before I consider myself a researcher. And I'm going to be honest with you, in school finance researchers are going to consider me an advocate before they consider me a researcher too, because that's just the way it is in school finance. But using that advocacy voice is how I, as an individual within my institution, attempt to push back and to problematize those barriers of justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, and access. Critical consciousness and anti-racism work, this isn't new to the lexicon of higher ed. I have ancestors, contemporary ancestors, that I lean on for support in their work when I'm having my own internal dialogue and asking myself, am I reinforcing the system now, right? Starting from the point of recognition that this system and my existence in this system is an aberration, is my recognition of how systemic inequities have continued to reify white supremacy in higher education. Now, the next step for me as an individual and advocate is, how am I going to, or what am I going to do today? And this isn't every day. What am I going to do today so that the next generation of thinkers, the next generation of advocates don't come up against as much resistance as I did? Earlier I said, I'll bring this back around because this is important for me, that higher education has operated in a racist, oppressive, racially violent space for people of color, and specifically for people like me. I'm from Chicago. I wear that on my sleeve. I'm not from Chicago. I'm from the south side of Chicago, educated in Chicago public schools. I'm one of those students that was called dumb. I'm one of those students that had to repeat years. I came up through the community college system with people that looked like me who were willing to support my success. I had to redo a junior year. And thank God that the dean was even willing to take me back into Curie High School. Because if it wasn't for the dean, I would have never gotten back. I went up through the system. The way that I got here was simple. It was an individual level of support from people willing to take the time to tell me, yes, things are not fair, things are not sufficient, but I am willing to support you through this pipeline so that you can support me in the work that I do at the end, and so that we could support each other. And if I support you, then maybe If we make it far enough, we could support 2 more. And then those 2 can support 2 more. And then those 2 can support 2 more. And the way to change systems, and we'll get to this in a second, the way to change systems is to reproduce anti-racist work and reproduce critical consciousness. If we sit back and take a stance of neutrality, then we're sitting back on the expectation that racism and oppression, that white supremacy will continue to dominate the narrative of our community. Now, I'm unwilling to do that. And I don't put this hat on anyone else. I keep saying I'm unwilling to do it. I'll take that responsibility. Now, whether someone else does it or not, and this is the linchpin, I don't care, because I'm doing it. That's my attitude toward this. So.
Thank you. Debbie, that was very helpful in grounding us. And I think a lot of the things that you said about understanding the system and really being educated is really important. And throughout the Anti-Racism 101 virtual series, we've endeavored to assist attendees in our Tuesday sessions to better understand the interconnected nature of systemic racism. So attendees can have a better perception of just how deep-seated and entrenched racism is and how it operates to contribute to our general miseducation of mainstream understanding of issues of inequity. And that's a pretty large undertaking, but nonetheless a necessary one, especially for those of us who are teaching and learning from students in the classroom. So as it relates to where well-meaning conversations about race can go wrong, right? Like making the lone Black student in the class a spokesperson for their race, or leaving things left unsaid when a shocking comment stuns a professor into silence. Can you help us, those of us who are going to be in the classroom, better understand how to, in a step-by-step sort of way, have challenging discussions about race in the classroom, considering the massive interconnected system of oppression that we're operating against?
Yeah. Another big question, right? So how can we ourselves press up against those barriers of oppression that constrain the pipeline of access, inclusion, justice, equity, and diversity in our institution, right? So let me say this. The roadmap is going to look different for everyone. You know, I ended the previous question by saying, I take the responsibility and this is how I do it, right? That roadmap is going to look different for us all. Some of us work on a system level. Some of us work on an individual level. Some of us work at both levels, right? But let me say this. Students that feel a way about what they're seeing at their institution or what people are telling them or what people are doing to them, they're talking to somebody. Don't get it twisted. They're coming to somebody. Now, we think maybe there's some silence, but if you've worked with students, you know that the silence is few and far between. So the question should be to us as we're thinking about it, are we being engaged in that conversation? And if not, why not? Why don't students feel that I could be an advocate or an ally, that I have affinity with their group? What is it about my actions that are making students not want to come to me for help? Especially, and I want to make this clear because I did go to Black at Wofford, especially if we're being called by name explicitly. If you're being called by your diverse student population by name explicitly, and you're sitting at a chair thinking that you're not being a challenge to these students, then you have to take a step back, check your bias at the door, check your privilege at the door, and ask yourself, why am I being explicitly named? No one's calling anyone out, but students are demonstrative and expressive. We have to accept that they are. We also have to accept that they have their ears and their minds to knowledge that they're creating, to knowledge that's coming up in the system. And if they're calling to question systems of oppression, racism, white supremacy, right, then we as educators have to keep sight of the fact that they see a tacit difference between how X person or institution treats them and Y person or institution treats them. And we have to learn from them. We have to become a learner. It's not going to be easy, right? Anti-racism work is never easy. We need to understand that there's a tacit difference between not being racist and being anti-racist, right? So let me say that again. We need to understand in our process of learning that there's a difference between not being a racist and anti-racist. Now, sitting back and saying, well, I'm not racist, is a fine first step in acknowledgement that potentially you don't have these problematic behaviors or narratives or opinions or deficit insights on communities of color. But being anti-racist, that's where the work really begins to take shape at a systems level, right? Now, I don't want to misquote, and I don't want to not do my due diligence with citing, so I want to make sure to bring up Ibram X. Kendi, who has also explicitly said, we are either racist or anti-racist, right? Now, consider that point for a second, that we are either racist or anti-racist. If we take a positionality that we work toward anti-racism or reify systems, whether by neutrality or by our own ontology of persisting and perpetuating oppression, that we have to question what we know and how we know it, including, and this goes for the instructors and the educators in the room, our pedagogy, our curriculum, and question our own internal knowledge. In earlier question, we use the word difference, right? And I problematize these words. What's the difference here? Because in saying that there are differences, we begin to put a very vertical bar on our understanding of existence. It's not a difference. We have to explicitly name what we're talking about. Because it wasn't too long ago when people thought I was racially different, right? That as a Mexican in this country, that I come from stock that wants to propagate drug use, a murderous ontology. And when I say not too long ago, I mean 2016. That's as close as you get. Am I different? Am I different than you? I'm Mexican, and I don't know if y'all could tell, but I present as Mexican. My colorism might be lighter, but most certainly in this country, there are certain communities that view me a certain way that I don't view myself, right? Think about how these words create and reify systems of oppression. How these words, by monolithicizing communities, reify systems of oppression and caste, right? We have to critically think about the cultural and systemic biases that reify white supremacy in our own life and how we approach the conversations as educators. As Anglo scholars, as white educators, are we allowing ourselves to become learners, to be the learner, to be honest with ourselves, right? How do we display that to those students that we care for? We have to be committed to anti-racist work and critical consciousness. And we have to be explicit and open in our commitment. We have to be willing to be open and explicit in that commitment because we also have to be willing to use our privilege to push back against colleagues, peers within our institution that reify those structures, that ostracize those students, that monolithicize the community. I brought up your statistical fast facts webpage, right? And call me out if I'm misspeaking. And I said, this is interesting because Wofford's got 20% minoritized students. That's what the statistics say. But the group in the fast facts is completely monolithicized. There's no way for me to tell what percentage of Black or Latinx students, Indigenous students, Asian students, who's even lumped into the category. And that's on the front page, right? These are the small ways that institutions structuralize white supremacy in this neutral manner. Now, we can tell racism, white supremacy, and oppression when it's overt. But these covert systems, these covert conversations, these are the things that we should be working toward ameliorating, right? I want to say one more thing on this point. It's not always up to our mentees to do the work for us. Black Wofford is doing a great service providing us their narrative, telling us where the missteps are, calling to question our epistemology of them, right? How are we using that in order to improve at a systems level? Furthermore, how are we using that to improve at an individual level, right? How are we using that to have conversations with those people that are explicitly named? And not in a manner that's sort of trying to proselytize, but in a manner that opens up a conversation to say, hey, I'm your colleague and I care about your success. I'm a colleague and I care about this student's success. How can we come together so that I can support you, so that we can, as a community, support this student that's expressing these things that are making them feel unwelcome, right? It's not always up to the students. It's not always up to Black, Indigenous, and Latinx people. The work can't be left to us. Because whether I'm at the table or not is one thing. Having the microphone, that's something else. That's a whole completely different thing. Now, I could be at the table, but do I have the microphone? Sometimes I feel like I do, right? Recently, I was asked by a school finance organization to give my input on their diversity initiatives. This is a clear example. When I did that, I did so openly. I wanted to help, but the response was, oh, we already do those things. My question then is, if you already do those things, what am I even here for? Don't you have great diversity, right? So at a systems level, it takes the individual to participate in the actions of anti-racism and critical consciousness, to pay attention, to help each other out.
Well, thank you, Dr. Martinez. In interest of time, we're going to transition here to our next panelist, Pierre Lucien, who was born and partially raised in Lakai, Haiti. The remainder of his formative years were spent in Brooklyn, Queens, and Long Island, New York. Pierre pursued his bachelor's degree at St. John's University before earning master's degrees from the Ohio State University and Brown University, respectively. He's currently a policy analyst for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts Department of Education and serves on the board of first-year advisors at Harvard University. Previously, Pierre was a research analyst at Harvard's Center for Education Policy Research. Thank you for joining us today, Pierre.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here to speak on this critically important topic.
Thank you. So our first question is related to this group that Dr. Martinez mentioned earlier. So Black at Wofford has engaged in deliberate and intentional activism and speaking truth to Wofford by creating a space for Black students, alum, and other members of the Wofford community to share their testimonies of racism, bias, and exclusion on campus. Many of those testimonies include experiences of racism, but also a lot of exclusion, not only in the classroom, but alleged specific instances of a desire to deliberately remove students of color from the entire academic discipline. It seems as though some professors and advisors, whether through social conditioning or explicit bias, believe that part of their job, at least, is to weed out students who might not be a good fit for their program. Can you talk more about how this approach results in a barrier to best anti-racist practices in academic advising?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I'm not at all surprised to hear this, and these challenges are not unique to Wofford, right? So I'm of the opinion that collegiate academic advising, as it is, will continue to contribute to systemic racism and reinforce racial inequity. Why is that? So you'd be hard pressed to find any advising framework that does not strongly consider and weigh preparation and interest in course selection and concentration declaration, right? So how does an advisor determine preparation and interest, right? So we actually use measures from the K-12 system. Now we know, at least during the first year, but we already know that the K-12 system is one that produces inequitable outcomes. So if we are using measures from a system that produces inequitable outcomes, what do you think is going to generate at the next level? Inequitable outcomes, right? So let's break that down a little bit. So if you're advising a first year student and you're determining their fit for a particular course or for a particular program of study by preparation, right? So you're using their prior course enrollment, prior course performance, their test scores, standardized tests, SATs, among others, and so on and so forth. So what's the issue with that? Well, we know that at the K-12 level, right, we have inequitable distribution of effective teachers. We know that there are less resources. We know that there are less exposure to rigorous courses, whether it be AP, IB, post-secondary, dual enrollment, and so on and so forth. So this is not a reflection of ability. This is a reflection of opportunity, right? So we use that measure to then, funnel students. We prescriptively, funnel students to a predetermined series of concentrations and courses based on their preparation, right? So it's like if you are admitting these students to your institution, you have to give them an equal opportunity to pursue or explore their academic interests. And using these traditional measures of preparation won't allow you to do that, right? And then, so the other component to fit is interest, right? So there are two aspects of interest. How does a student express or demonstrate interest in a particular field of study or a course? Well, they can tie it to a career, so a career connection, or they can, passionately express their intellectual curiosity in the particular field of study, right? But again, it goes back to this idea of like, well, if they weren't exposed to this course in high school, right? If they didn't have the AP and so on and so forth, if they don't have members of their community who pursued careers that correspond with that field of study, they're not going to be able to demonstrate the interests in the same manner as a suburban middle class like white student would. But again, this is not necessarily an inherent disposition or lack of interest in this like field of study. It's a lack of exposure. So what we need to do, if we want to disrupt systemic racism in terms of academic advising, we have to look beyond preparation and interest, at least as we traditionally define them, because they're going to reinforce and reproduce and yield exactly what the K-12 system is doing, and that is racial disparity. And this is gonna manifest itself economically, politically, socially, and so on and so forth.
Thanks, Pierre. So I want to pivot a little bit to a question related to the systemic nature of racism as it relates to advising at predominantly white institutions. The overwhelming majority of academic advisors are white. Some of those advisors might say things like, I'm not racist, I care deeply for my Black, Indigenous, Latinx, other student of color students, right? Which may be absolutely true, except anti-racist work is active, and it's not about not being racist, as Dr. Martinez mentioned before, but it is about actively being anti-racist. But the point is, that statement does not recognize that the advising system that we're operating in can result in one set of outcomes for white students and a completely different set of outcomes for BIPOC students. So how can advisors go about disrupting advising policies and procedures, as well as racist interpersonal interactions that perpetuate barriers to anti-racist practices and advisement?
I think this is a great follow-up question to the previous one, right? So again, I've participated in and even have had the opportunity to oversee a variety of like advisement trainings, and it's, you know, unfortunately it's very prescriptive, right? It's almost like formulaic, right? So you have these measures, and from these measures you determine where students ought to go and where they belong or where they fit. And this is the danger of color blindness, because essentially, you know, these frameworks, they operate, you know, with color blindness. But again, if we're using the measures from the previous system that produces inequitable outcomes, and we're, you know, operating with color blindness at this level, it's going to continue to produce. So as an advisor, what can you do? Go beyond the prescription. And so you need to be a thought partner. You need to engage a student, be a thought partner, be a sounding board. But there are two particular things I would want advisors to do, right? The first one is to affirm their students. So, you know, racial minority or otherwise underrepresented groups that are navigating predominantly white campuses are facing, you know, a variety of stressors. And you know, so firstly, this doesn't apply to everyone equally, but many of these students are experiencing, you know, imposter syndrome. Essentially, they believe that they're fraudulent and they'll be exposed at some point, or that they may not belong. So it is imperative that someone of influence or of authority, like an academic advisor, and you know, affirms that they belong on this campus, they belong at the institution. And then also to advocate, right? So, you know, I don't know how it operates at Wofford, but a lot of institutions, you know, after your first year, you must apply to different concentrations before you get admitted, and so on and so forth. Like how much advocacy work is happening, you know, on behalf of students when they apply to these, you know, if I'm the, you know, director of some concentration of some program, I too am using my traditional measures of fit, right? It makes a big difference if an advisor who's worked with a student for an entire year can reach out to me and speak with me about a particular student, you know, but because of their background, right? They may not have had exposure to AP biology. They may not have had, you know, they didn't have the resources to prep for an SAT subject test, right? But I worked with them for a year, and they're very passionate. They work very hard. Here are the variety of efforts they've made to perform well, you know, and despite having come underprepared, they were able to keep up with their peers, if not outperform them, and, you know, they should be given some additional consideration. So, like, I think advocacy is particularly important, given that the measures that are often used to prescribe advising are inherently inequitable.
Thanks, Pierre. Another question. So research has shown that students from historically marginalized communities, particular BIPOC communities, attending predominantly white institutions experience a unique set of challenges within the college environment, which you alluded to, and imposter syndrome, but can also include daily microaggressions, a limited or no sense of belonging, covert and overt racism. And that's in addition to larger overarching societal stressors as a result of systemic racism, right? So how are these challenges exacerbated when a student's academic advisor is unable or unwilling to do the things that you just mentioned, right? Of centering experiences of students of color, normalizing and normalizing racialized experiences and providing a systemic context for racial oppression on a predominantly white campus like Wofford?
I think it would be particularly helpful for not just like academic advisors, right, but any administrator or staff or faculty who engages students, to create safe spaces for students to express themselves and what they're going through, but also to believe them. And so what I mean by that is racial battle fatigue is real, right? Like to consistently experience microaggressions, or even some of the more overt acts of racism it's exhausting, and especially when your student body is predominantly white. There aren't as many people to share these experiences with, or to comfort you. So I think one of the few things that unfortunately happens when a student expresses a concern or shares a negative experience is that well-intended people say things like, oh, he couldn't have meant that, or it couldn't have been that, or that wasn't the intention behind it, right? Well, irrespective of intent, there's an impact. And if you're my advisor, I'm expressing to you something negative that I've experienced, and your first reaction is to defend somebody you don't know, to invalidate my experience, as if I'm overreacting. And I think that reinforces the sense of not belonging, right? It's like, oh wow, so it must be me, right? If I'm telling you what's happened to me and your first response is, oh, it couldn't have been that way, so it must be me, right? So not only do I not have the right skin for this campus, I don't even have the right lens for this campus. So I think creating, believing students, affirming them, creating safe spaces, meet them where they are and seek understanding, definitely validating them. And I think that ties into the advocacy work as well, right? So, if there is a well-intended group of people who have done something, sometimes it could be, speaking with them and addressing them. If it's like a club or a faculty member, or some kind of a residential community, and so on and so forth. So, advocating for students. So essentially being a passive prescriptive advisor will not disrupt systemic racism. It will not contribute to inclusive experiences for minority students.
Pierre, and just following up, can you elaborate a little bit on what you mean by a safe space?
I think in this context, in terms of race, I think a safe space is an environment or an atmosphere in which a student feels comfortable to express their thoughts, their feelings, and to feel validated and supported, as opposed to undermined, questioned, judged, or dismissed.
Thank you.
And that can be both, that's both physical, right? So you can literally have a physical space on campus where there are staff who do this kind of work, but also it could be when you're speaking with a student over the phone, right? Letting them know that I'm here, this is your story and your narrative, I'm here to support you, as opposed to I'm going to explain to you how you misinterpreted what happened to you.
Exactly. Thank you. And so this concludes the panel portion of our talk today. And so we're going to transition over into some questions. And so, Dr. Martinez, I'm going to ask you the first question. This question is, so I know you're a policy guy, so I have to ask a policy question. And as a lawyer who was trained by some of the best legal minds at Georgetown, my professors did a phenomenal job at helping me understand the legal system and how seemingly unrelated legal issues don't stand alone, but are instead part and parcel of a much grander design. And I'm of the opinion, and I'm not alone in this, because there are tons of scholars of law and other disciplines that may think this way as well, that when it comes to issues of racism, bias, and equity, that most issues don't stem from this individual bad racist actor. And as a result, our focus should be fixed on the structural implications of racism and how regimes of power operate to perpetuate the problems that we face, like, for example, in higher education. So my question to you is, how do we address these issues policy-wise on a large scale at an institutional level to ensure that we create our own anti-racist classrooms, but also making sure that other classrooms across campus are also anti-racist, right? So if you could give me a really quick 2-minute answer.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is really a question about agency and what we think we are capable of inside of the system, right? So I want to invoke two really quick pieces of information. One, I want to make sure that I'm bringing up Wofford as a place and as a space, something that Schodsky would call a site ontology, right? Our site ontology is informed by where we're at in the Southeast. We're informed by our history of being a port of slavery. We're informed as a state and inculcated as a state inside of a white supremacist system, right? That's full on. If we acknowledge that piece, right, and we think about these regimes, right, and if we think about policy regimes as not some aggregated entity, but we think about it as a system of individuals coming together to believe, institutionalize, and reify a certain thing or a certain policy, and consider that against our own site ontology here in South Carolina, then we begin to recognize that the system is just created of individuals, right? That reinforcement of a system isn't outside of the scope of the individual. There has to be people willing to adhere to and accept that white supremacy and oppression is okay, and adhere to and accept that by any means necessary, we will institutionalize policies in order to oppress people of color, right? That's why as individuals, we have to be the ones to take up the mantle of anti-racist work and anti-racist action and push back and problematize it where we see it. Recently, article came out, Lawrence Mead from NYU has made a career off of this ideology that there is a culture of poverty inside of Black, Indigenous, Latinx communities, inside of communities of color. Tenured, full professor, private institution, right? My agency and the agency of those that support me, however, said that's untrue of my people, that's untrue of my community. And in pushing back against it together, we got the article retracted. And this happened really, really recently. That's what anti-racist action looks like. It starts with the idea that you yourself have power to change, and you yourself have power to change systems.
Thank you. Next question. Let's start with Pierre. So as many of us in the Zoom room prepare to receive students in advisement, what parting advice do you have for advisors in addressing barriers to anti-racist advising? Particularly, what and how should we be disrupting the system to create a space where our students aren't merely existing, but thriving?
Go beyond prescriptive advising. Go beyond prescriptive advising. Look beyond the traditional measures or indicators of preparedness that we've used. Explore interests. And I would also say, if students are coming in with lack of exposure, then expose them. As in, like, expose them to careers and career fairs and research opportunities, internships, study abroad. So there are a variety of ways in which a person can develop interest in a field of study. And it's extremely difficult for that to happen without exposure. Right, and just know that our students are coming in with different levels of exposure, and that's associated with their race and their socioeconomic status. How can, imagine, like, you know, even myself, so as a policy analyst, I absolutely love what I do. I wasn't exposed to it until graduate school. I have colleagues who knew that they wanted to go into policy when they're 18. I learned about, policy, quantitative policy analysis when I was like 24, 25 in graduate school.
Thanks, Pierre. Dr. Martinez, similar question. As many of us in the Zoom room prepare to receive students in the classroom, what parting advice do you have for professors and instructors in addressing barriers to anti-racist classrooms? Particularly, what and how should we be disrupting the system to create a space where our students aren't just existing, but thriving?
Great question. So really big policy related questions, right? So ultimately, the lifeblood of white supremacy is this idea of denial, that we ourselves are beyond being racist or beyond racism or beyond oppression, right? And I, in conversation with colleagues, always ask, what are we doing in our own practices to perpetuate justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, access, right? How are we ourselves perpetuating this inclusiveness to make students feel like they belong, right? It's in the classroom culture. It's in the culture of our pedagogy, of our curriculum, what we use, how we treat and greet and participate inside of community, right? There's ultimately going to be no silver bullet. Each one of us are going to need to come back, center, and think, what am I including in my classroom, right? And recognize that discomfort is a part of the growth process, which we haven't talked about today. And having these conversations is going to be very uncomfortable with for some of us, and that's okay. That's okay. That's us acknowledging that we're not the experts. That's us acknowledging that we might be placed inside of this ontology of being a learner again. Don't be afraid to sit back and take that position of the learner. We learn from students every day. I brought up at Black Wofford and said, they're giving us information that's necessary to engage in anti-racist practice. Are we taking that and using it, right? One of the definitive things I do in my classroom is to inculcate anti-racist readings and anti-racist pedagogy and critical consciousness inside of my readings. And again, economics of education, school finance, quantitative methods, right? But inside of those quantitative methods to say, listen, these buckets that we're putting communities in, these are people. We're monolithicizing an entire people by calling it Hispanic. Do you know that inside of the Latinx community, people are indigenous, people are Black, people are from different countries. People don't even speak the same language inside of our Latinx community, right? The same with indigeneity. Indigeneity is not one monolithic thing, right? We want to create inclusiveness in our classroom, and it happens through this microsystem level change. I work at a PWI in an educational leadership department, right? I have one mentee currently, a young man, Afro-Latinx young man from the East Coast. People are astounded that my mentee, Hector, would be at this PWI. It was a process of recruitment. It was time. It was me going out and advocating in the community. It was seeking it out. It was the fact that I include anti-racist readings and critical conscious readings into these quantitative courses, and that I force the issue to create work that is not neutral, that is not just based in race, but that is anti-racist, and that is race-based work. And that switch inside of my pedagogy really helped me in the long run.
Thank you. So this concludes the Q&A portion of the session. And I just want to provide a brief overview for Thursday's session, right? So if you all have attended these or watched these anti-racism virtual teach-ins, then you know that our Tuesday sessions are generally a massive overview, and then the Thursday sessions are more directed in answering specific questions and specific hypothetical scenarios and situations. And so on Thursday, we'll do a deeper dive into some actual scenarios and how faculty and instructors might be able to test drive some of those hypotheticals and scenarios in the event that they come up in the classroom, right? Handling hot moments is going to be what Thursday session is going to be all about, and to provide you with tangible tools on how to do so. So I want to take this time to recognize Dr. Ann Katia through her partnership in this portion of the Anti-Racism Virtual Teach-In series, because it was a collaborative effort with the CIL and Anti-Racism Action Team. I also want to acknowledge Dr. Trina Janik-Jones for her support in making these sessions a reality as well. And last but certainly not least, I want to recognize the organizers of these anti-racism sessions, Dr. Jim Neighbors, Dr. Rhiannon Liebrick, Dr. Camille Bethea, Dr. Kim Rostan, Dr. Kimberly Hall, Dr. Tasha Smith-Tyus, Mr. James Stutz, Professor Jessica Scott Felder, Ms. Tiara Loney, and Ms. Nadia Glover. So as colleagues, we formed the Anti-Racism Action Team and met our commitment to host these sessions throughout this summer. And we've recommitted ourselves to this work and plan to continue doing anti-racism work throughout the academic year by consulting with departments and divisions who are interested in incorporating anti-racist pedagogy and inclusive practices into their curriculum practices and programs. So if you're interested, just reach out to any one of us on the team and we could begin that process. In the meantime, we've updated the anti-racism guide with additional tools and resources. So please continue to use that to develop your anti-racism skills further. And I will provide a link to that in the chat so everyone has it. And then I also want to let you know that now we're transitioning into the optional breakout room discussions, and the breakout rooms were based on your responses to the RSVP form and your respective disciplines. So in the breakout rooms, you'll have up to 31 minutes to debrief and discuss this session. After your discussion, the Anti-Racism Action Team organizer assigned to your room will dismiss you from the session. So I'll begin that process now. Thank you all for engaging in this work, and I look forward to seeing you all on Thursday.
Thank you.
Thanks, David.